Coming up on IMF Today.
To everybody coming to the meetings, roll your sleeves. Let's continue in that spirit of getting things done.
There's enough money in the world, there's enough capital in the world to make it work.
What you're doing at the Spring Meetings, I say, is collecting this tribe together, having formal and informal rituals to recreate networks, and above all else, to recreate a shared worldview.
1/3 of the world's population is poorly connected to the internet, and another third is not connected at all. 5 billion people badly connected. What would be the perks of connecting every village and every household to the internet?
Hello and welcome. We are live at the IMF 2023 Spring Meetings. I'm Amanda Walker and this is IMF Today. Now, ministers, economists, governors, journalists, they're all flooding through the IMF HQ doors as we speak. On their minds, the big global challenges we all face: slow growth, persistent inflation, escalating borrowing costs, and looming debt crises, to name a few. Every day this week, we'll have headlines and analysis from top-level meetings, seminars and events, plus interviews with all the big economic hitters. Now, for those who don't know the geography, the World Bank and the IMF are across the street from each other here in downtown Washington, D.C. And earlier today, as always happens on the first day of the meetings, the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina, sat down with World Bank Group President David Malpass. Shortly after that, she spoke with me for IMF Today. We're delighted to be joined by Managing Director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. Thank you so much for joining us on IMF Today. Now tell me,
pleasure.
What is top of your mind going into these spring meetings?
The membership is coming together at a time of high uncertainty, and there are three big topics we would be wrestling with. One, how to make sure that we can sustain price stability, fight inflation, and also financial stability, protect the financial system. Two, how to deal with the issue of debt. When interest rates are high, countries that have borrowed to fight the COVID crisis are now faced with the need to handle that and sometimes restructure it. Three, how to build a foundation for more robust growth in the future. How to make that future greener and more reliant on the fabulous force of digital technology.
And obviously these meetings are about everybody coming together. And I'm interested in something that you said this morning in conversation with David Malpass. You said that the ropes that tie us together have become weaker. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, what we have seen is the forces of fragmentation becoming stronger. They have two big drivers. One, the horrible war in Ukraine. It has not only been a source of tremendous pain for people in the country, but it has also added to geopolitical tensions. Two, the recognition that came from COVID, it came from the impact of the war, that no more we can make decisions for allocation of supply chains only on the basis of cost. Security of supply matters. And the fact that globalization did not benefit everyone has created a pushback on something that actually has made the world richer and more secure. So when we look at the years ahead, it is paramount to recognize that, yes, we have to be more careful about the security of supply chains. Yes, the national security interests are meaningful. Yes, the war in Ukraine put an end to the peace dividend that we have enjoyed for three decades. We cannot take peace anymore for granted, but we can move through this by still keeping the fabric of the world economy integrated. We have calculated that the cost of fragmentation just in the area of trade can go all the way up to 7% of global GDP. This is like wiping out Japan and Germany at the same time for the world economy. Unaffordable. So we have to work hard to still address these issues that have come over the last years, but do it as much as possible together. And that is the beauty of this place. This is where we bring 190 countries to work together for a better future for everyone.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Finally, I know how busy you are, but what's your message to all these delegates who are arriving in Washington, D.C.? What can they hope to achieve and see happen this week?
When there is a will, there is a way. We can take decisions together that reflect different perspectives, and we can do what our founding fathers did in the midst of a war in 1944. Build solidarity, because a world without it is a poorer and less secure world. I also beg everybody to pay attention that over the last years we face a dangerous divergence. The better off countries have a chance to help their businesses and people. The poorer countries are falling further behind. So one of the messages I have is, do show empathy for people and countries that need help to cope with the challenges we face.
Okay. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a crucial week for those countries who are really struggling. IMF First Deputy Managing Director Gita Gopinath joins me now. Challenging times, Gita. These interest rate hikes may help with inflation, but they're not helping with debt. Can you just expand on that connection for me and the challenge that that presents?
Hi, Amanda. Always a pleasure to join you. Firstly, I would say that there is the impact that higher interest rates have, of course, on your cost of borrowing. But there's also the additional piece, which is the risks to financial stability. So interest rates have to go up to bring down inflation, but you want to be able to do that while maintaining financial stability and also your debt being sustainable. I think at this point it's critical for fiscal policy to help monetary policy in bringing inflation down. That will also then help with the debt situation. It's also important to build up buffers in the fiscal space because, you know, we're getting hit by shock after shock, and rising interest rates could generate financial market distress that might require fiscal support. So this is, I would say, a three sets of targets that are required: bringing inflation down while maintaining financial stability and its sustainability.
So there's a lot of representatives from countries coming here with big worries and big concerns about what their future holds in terms of debt. What is the IMF going to do to help those countries cope with the challenges of debt that could lie ahead?
Yeah, debt has gone up to very high levels after the pandemic and now the war. Again, countries being hit with multiple shocks. How you deal with it, of course, depends upon country-specific circumstances. For the countries that are, I would say, advanced economies and several major economies, this is the time to build up buffers. Again, like I said, that's going to also help with bringing inflation down. But there are many low-income countries that are in debt distress. So we have about 15% of low-income countries that are also kind of already in debt distress, and about 45% more that are in high risk of debt distress. And we have about 25% of emerging markets also in that category of being in a risky situation. For a lot of these countries, I think it's also very important that we have well-functioning debt restructuring frameworks. The common framework that was put up by the G20 is very helpful. We've made some progress in that dimension, but a lot more is needed. And this is something that the IMF is working with the World Bank, with India's G20 presidency to put in place a global sovereign debt roundtable. This is something that we launched a couple of months ago, which is to help improve the debt restructuring process, which is going to be critical for many countries.
Another big challenge, growth or lack of it, the lowest since 1990. Just remind us, how did we get here and how do we get out of that?
So there's a combination of what I would describe as secular trends and the fact that we're coming out of some very severe shocks. The secular trends are that we have aging demographics in many parts of the world, which are driving weaker growth. We also have China that was growing at a very high rate. It was a young emerging market, and it's now longer young. It's an advanced emerging market, and therefore you would expect the economy to slow in terms of growth rates, and also for the world economy that has implications. The more recent trends are the pandemic and the war. For several countries, both of them have thrown them off their growth trajectory and thrown them off their development path. So these are the kinds of headwinds that we face. In terms of what's needed, I think it's critical that countries continue to invest in human capital. We need to have the green transition happen. It's absolutely critical for the planet. So generating the kind of funding that's required to have the necessary investment in that space is absolutely critical. Digital public infrastructure, we know around the world, helps in terms of raising productivity. So these are, I think, measures that are going to be important to raise growth.
And just finally, I'm interested from your perspective. You know, you've very experienced, obviously, and been dealing in this world for so long. And do you see this, as everybody talks about now, as a time of major concern and crisis? We never really talk about easy times, do we? Do you see, though, in terms of your perspective and your experience, that this is a real moment of challenge?
It is a challenging time for the global economy. We've said that since the start of the year, that this year is going to be challenging. At the same time, I will recognize that in many countries in the world, labor markets are strong, unemployment rates are at record lows, and spending has held up over these last couple of years. So there are hopeful signs, but that said, overall, I would say the risks are to the downside. The war is not over. It could escalate. We have debt issues in many countries that could be very problematic. We might need even higher interest rates to tackle inflation, which can then spill over to financial markets and generate much more stress that we've seen. So there are many things we need to fix, but that's the point of having these meetings, where we come together, have deep discussions on how we can address the challenges the world economy faces and how we need to work together, because if we can't work together, we just cannot get this done.
Right. So I think we can take a chink of optimism there. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Gita Gopinath, first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Now, it's no secret that at the end of June, World Bank Group President David Malpass will be stepping down. This morning, he discussed his tenure with IMF Managing Director Georgieva and his concerns for the future.
A lot of what we've done over these my 4 years it has been on specific countries and regions. How do you solve problems in various parts of the world? But then that has confronted this giant macro overlay of the world of COVID, slow growth, rising interest rates, and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All of that conspiring in a way to give not enough money for any of the goals that we have for people in developing countries. So I feel good about, it's been a very busy 4 years, and prior to that at the U.S. Treasury, working on similar issues at a very rapid pace. So I feel good about that, very good about the World Bank group, all of our entities, but also worried, I guess I'll say, frankly, about prospects for people in developing countries. There's not a good avenue. I like your point of optimism. We have technology. We have institutions that care. We have there's enough money in the world. There's enough capital in the world to make it work. But my concern is it's all absorbed into a small group.
So again, some optimism there, tempered with a need for change. Joining me now is the president of the Centre for Global Development, Masood Ahmed. Now, he served for many years in senior positions at the IMF and World Bank, focusing on development finance and debt. So he's an expert on everything that we're going to be discussing here this week. So first of all, just give me a sense. You've been to a few of these meetings. What is the mood going into the 2023 spring meetings?
I think the mood going into the meetings, Amanda, is a combination of expectation and anxiety. And I think the anxiety comes from the point that the managing director first made about uncertainty, the point that Gita Gopinath just made about how you need to balance the need to manage inflation down, but at the same time not have financial instability. I think a lot of countries are coming into this week thinking, so where does that leave me? What clarity can I get during the course of this week? And I hope that this week they'll be able to get some sense of were the bank wobbles that we had a few weeks ago now behind us? Should we be worrying about more to come? How much should they be concerned if you're a developing country, particularly if you're an emerging market? So that's going to be, I think, the anxiety part. And then we can talk about the expectations.
Do you think the word you just used, clarity, is that the ultimate, most feasible expectation countries have coming in here? And is the IMF in a position at the moment to offer that kind of clarity that, let's face it, everybody needs right now?
Yes, I think there is uncertainty, there will be uncertainty, but I see one of the big roles of the IMF and of these gatherings as an opportunity for ministers to come together and narrow that band of uncertainty. So if by the time you leave, you have a sense that says, yeah, I kind of understand, you know, the world is not entirely predictable, but I get a sense of, on the scale of 1 to 10, how much should I be worried? You know, and I think we need to do that during the course of the week. I don't think anybody else can do it as well as the IMF mobilizing the expertise, not just of its staff, but also of all the economic leaders of the world who are gathering here. If you're from an emerging market, you're not going to get the kind of opportunity to be in a room listening to people from advanced economies, from low-income countries, sharing their perspectives. So I think, yes, it's a feasible expectation to have.
Just focusing on those lower-income countries, yes. When I spoke earlier to Managing Director Georgieva, she said poorer countries are falling further behind. Now, we knew this was on the cards, but we're seeing it happen now. How do we stop it? Can we stop it?
Well, I think this is where the expectations part comes in. I think there are two bits of expectation. One is the poorer countries and how they see this week and what they hope to get out of it. The other one also, which is a very big issue for many countries, is what is this rethinking about the future of the World Bank and the MDBs and the fact there's a new president coming in? What does this mean for the way these institutions will operate in trying to deal with their development needs, but also dealing with global challenges? But let's come back to the poorer countries that you raised. And look, from a poor country point of view, you're being told that the world is going to be more difficult going forward. The managing director talked about fragmentation, the consequences of that.
Yeah, which ultimately she's saying the world isn't working together as it should, and that's why we're here and coming together.
If you're a poor country, you say, first issue on their mind is their financial needs are, if anything, going to be higher next 5 years, right? And yet, the IMF's lending to the poorest countries is both lower than it used to be a couple of years ago, and it's being held back from increasing because it doesn't have the resources to provide the subsidy money to make that lending concessional. So I think that's a high priority. It's not a lot of money. We need to try and get that part sorted between now and Marrakesh in October. And the other issue for them is, you look at across the street, and IDA, which is a very big provider of financing, provided $37 billion this fiscal year, is projected to drop off by a third next year. So they see the resources shrinking on the multilateral institutions. They see the debt problem. And for 2 years, they've been in the middle of this tussle amongst the creditors on how are we going to find a way of solving it. And what they're saying is, look, you guys need to sort this out. But we're getting caught in the middle of this. And I think they're saying we need to look at it a bit from our perspective of how can we work with, while you sort out your future relationships. And I don't think geopolitical tensions are going to make it easy to sort out those relationships, because the creditors are basically the traditional Paris Club creditors on the one side, new ones including China, and it'll take a bit of time to work that through. But in the meantime, countries are finding themselves, they reach agreement on a program to move forward with the IMF, on the policies, that's what really matters, but they can't move with the financing because the creditors haven't quite agreed amongst themselves on how to deal with the debt. That kind of leaves them hoping that this week we might go beyond describing the problem to actually trying to find ways to move us forward.
Yeah. Solving problems, which of course everyone wants to do, perhaps easier said than done. Masood, Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us on IMF Today.
Thank you.
Now, aside from the big headline speeches, there's so much else happening in these buildings. Delegates are arriving from across the world, lining up outside in the fresh DC spring sunshine to take part in a whole range of different events. Now, today alone, analytical corner presentations, they form a big part of the week's agenda. They're basically where IMF staff share some of their year-round hard work and latest research with attendees. And the G24 deputies met to interpret how the conversations taking place this week will impact developing countries, which are obviously a massively important part of the IMF's work. Then we had IMF Inspired, which is essentially a platform for conversation and ideas. Author and Financial Times journalist Gillian Tett shared hers, and it was really thought-provoking stuff. She explored the notion that economists should use anthropology to navigate these tough times.
If you look at the world through the lens of a narrow economic model, which certainly became very fashionable in the late 20th century, or I should say through the lens of a narrow corporate balance sheet of the sort that, Milton Friedman said people should only focus on, you end up basically missing everything that's off the balance sheet out of the model. And if the world is stable, then that may not matter. But we don't live in a stable world today. Things are changing around us all and around the models. And the image I use sometimes is if you rely just on an economic model to try and navigate with, you're like somebody walking through a dark wood at night with a compass, and your compass may be technically brilliant, and you don't want to throw your compass away. But if you just look down at your dial all the time as you walk through the wood, you're going to walk into a tree or trip over a tree root and bang your head. And the same way, you don't want to throw your models away or your balance sheet, but you have to look at it in context and see what's beyond the model. What are the assumptions? What is left out? And it so happens that in the last 10 years, all the stuff that's been left out, like the environment, like medical risk, like social tensions, like the impact of technology on consumer behavior, all of that stuff that used to be in the footnotes of the corporate balance sheet or an externality to the models, that's become in many ways the most important thing. So what I'm arguing for is not rip up economic models. I'm not even arguing that one should spend most of your time looking at the things beyond the balance sheet or beyond the economic models, but you need to be aware of it.
So that's a big part of what these meetings are about, discussing ideas and visions about how to tackle the unique challenges of today. And ultimately, a lot of it comes down to trying to improve lives. Taking the messages of the meetings to the people is, of course, the job of journalists. Joining me now is Paula Escalada Medrano from the Spanish news agency EFE. So just give us a sense, Paula, thank you for your time, of what it's like being a journalist here, because there's plenty of journalists, right, all looking for their own unique lines out of this.
Yeah. So for us this week, to be honest, it's a little bit overwhelming,
Yeah.
because of the huge agenda you have, the IMF have, and also the World Bank. So, and also because all the politicians that come here do also parallel events. So for us, it's a little bit overwhelming to find the most important thing. So it's super important to have a preparation and to have a good agenda to be able to choose, to select the most important features to be able to communicate what is going on here, because I'm telling you that the agenda is crazy.
Yeah, there is a lot going on. So when you have that
on.
piece of paper in front of you that shows you all the events of the week, what have you highlighted? Where do you need to be? What's important for you in terms of your coverage?
I think one of the most important events these days is the World Economic Outlook.
Yes.
When they are going to publish the data, especially because of the time we are facing, you know. After all the interest rate hike and the financial problems with the banks here at the States and also in Europe, it's very interesting to know how this is gonna affect the data. So what is going to happen, you know? And also I think one of the key issues is also the debt relief. We really want to hear all the proposals about what is going on with the debt relief for the low-income countries. We want to know if they reach any kind of agreement. So I would say these two issues as one of the most important ones.
Thank you so much, Paula, Escalada, Medrano. Good luck for the rest of the week. Thanks for joining us on IMF Today.
Thank you, I need it.
Now back to the analytical corners, where IMF staff get to share their latest research with an audience and take questions about what it all means. This year's topics range from climate finance in sub-Saharan Africa to fragmentation in global trade. 7 of them were presented today, the other 6 come tomorrow. And here's just a snippet from one all about public perceptions of climate mitigation policies.
We find that subsidies for renewable energy and green technologies are the most well-known policies and also the most supported. So it is not surprising that they feature prominently in the climate policy agendas of most governments, including, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the Green Deal Industrial Plan in Europe.
But climate experts would note that subsidies alone cannot do the job. Carbon pricing, which in simple terms means having polluters pay for their emissions, must be a part of the policy mix because it provides the correct incentives to individuals and businesses to lower their carbon footprint, which is the goal of emissions reduction. Ultimately, achieving these emissions reduction goals will require a mix of several policies, including subsidies and carbon pricing. But our survey finds that carbon pricing is both less well-known and less popular.
And look who's joining me now, Salma Khalid and Giacomo Magistretti, both economists at the IMF, fresh from that very analytical corner. Now, we'll go into the detail of your research in a moment, but I just want to know, what's it like to reach this point where you get to share your work?
I mean, it's definitely very exciting for both of us, and we have to mention that, you know, it takes a village. We had a much larger team. Some of them were in the audience today who are attending, and we're very appreciative of their support and also the institutional support we received in order to carry this work forward. And also a plug for the Analytical Corner people, like the people who helped arrange the Analytical Corners. They provided us with a great platform. We're very excited, and we get to see other people's exciting work as well. So there was a number of presentations today, a number of presentations in the next few days. So it's I think it's a great opportunity to be able to share our work with such a broad platform of, you know, stakeholders and, you know, participants from around the world, really.
Yeah, I bet it is. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but your research is generally, I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's about public perception of climate change policy. Why does that matter in and of itself?
So it matters because we know that the planet is fast approaching a tipping point in global temperatures, and experts are saying that if we pass the tipping point, then consequences will become irreversible and devastating. This is going to have economic consequences, social consequences, so it's no surprise that it's becoming top of mind for many policymakers.
But the public perception of what governments are doing, I mean, from your perspective, is crucial to making those policies work?
Yeah, of course, because of course, we need bold actions from governments, and governments and policymakers cannot take those actions if they don't have the buy-in from the public. So we really wanted to get at this notion of what the public knows and what the public thinks about those policies that have been discussed.
And what were some of the questions that you asked people?
So we were a little systematic. We went about it by initially trying to get a sense of what people perceive are the risks from climate change. And it's kind of very I guess it shouldn't be surprising, but it's vindicating really for us that at this point there is broad recognition that there are high risks from climate change and they're going to be affecting people quite imminently. But then we go on to ask more specific questions, such as what their knowledge of climate policies is and whether or not they perceive costs and benefits from these policies. So for a broad range of actual policy options, such as subsidies for renewable energy, carbon pricing, we ask individuals what do they perceive are the costs and benefits to households, to businesses, so on and so forth. Then we derive a baseline level of support for these policies, and we go on to do these small information experiments to see whether or not we can nudge people from this baseline level of support, change their minds based on the information that we're providing them about these policies.
Okay, hugely important work. Thank you for that, and thank you for joining us on IMF Today. Good luck with the rest of the week.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Well, I hope we've given you a strong sense of day one. 4 more packed days to go, and tomorrow is a big one, starting with the World Economic Outlook at 9 a.m. That's followed by the Global Financial Stability Report. The G24 will also hold a press conference, and we'll have our first in the series of governor talks. This one focused on the Philippines. And right behind me here in HQ1 Atrium, we'll have our first seminar on climate finance and energy security. That's it from us right now, though. Thanks for joining us on this first Spring Meetings episode of IMF Today. I'm Amanda Walker, and I'll be back with you here tomorrow live at 5 p.m. DC time. We'll leave you today with some of the best pictures of the day.